Grace and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Before we start reading the first chapter of Genesis, I'm sure you've all heard it at some stage before, or probably many times. So let me start with a question. Based on what you've read and what you've discussed, maybe in a Bible study before, what in your mind does the biblical creation account want to proclaim? What does it want to tell us? Just think that through in your mind for a second. I'm not going to ask for answers now out loud. What does the biblical creation account want to proclaim? What does it want to tell us? Now, some Christians want to shoehorn this account. I don't know whether you've ever seen a shoehorn. It's a bit of an old-fashioned device. I love that word. You know what a shoehorn is? It's what the in the olden days people used to use to get their shoes on, to force their feet into the shoe. Some Christians want to shoehorn this account of creation into our modern mindset. The argument goes, we want a factual account of what happened so that we can have it all in black and white. Isn't the Bible supposed to answer all our questions about the universe? The problem is, the Bible is not a science textbook, nor is it a text designed to prove or disprove any scientific theory that has been developed in modern times. Using it like that would be similar to trying to get a scientific explanation of what happens in your brain when you fall in love by reading a love poem. Not going to work. When we read the biblical creation accounts, we must be careful to not demand that it answers questions that the original authors never intended to answer when they wrote it. Let's remember that in the end, the scriptures are a witness to God's work in the universe and in the lives of people, not a scientific manual that settles all discussions on the mechanics of it once and for all. That, I believe, was never the intention of the original authors. And to demand that as a 21st century reader is simply arrogant or pointless. Instead, I invite us all to let us be drawn into the wonder of creation by these texts, to get our eyes open to the grandeur that is around us. And just now as you sit, just take a look around, even in our own churchyard here, which is not exactly the most impressive part of God's creation, but still, with the beautiful trees around us, with the birds, it's a beautiful place, nevertheless, and something that shares something of this amazing wonder of God's creation around us. Let us let the joy of discovering God's creation take hold in our hearts. Because just like a love poem is best understood by someone who is in love, the creation poetry is best understood by someone who is in awe of the Creator. There are many ways to tell the truth, and poetry is one of these ways. And in poetry, the truth is not conveyed in cold, hard facts, but rather in pictures that draw you in. When the love-struck poet says, "My love is like a rose," that is the truth. You don't go asking them, well, how many thorns did the stem have? You simply hear the picture and understand his love is like a rose. Now, moving on to the creation account in Genesis 1. Picture yourself around a log fire on a chilly evening in early spring. You are in a Jewish settlement in Babylon during the exile. For this is where these stories of origin, as many scholars call them, came into being. A rabbi with a long beard that would have made Moses himself proud is sitting on a rock. And a young child by his side says, "Abba, Daddy." Tell us the one about how the Lord made the heavens and earth. And the rabbi starts to tell the story. And maybe you want to close your eyes to hear better. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And it was so. God called the expanse sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the ground land, and gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seeds in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw it was good. There was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark seasons and days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems, according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, and wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. What do you hear when you hear this poem of creation? First thing that I hear is God is the creator. God is the one who makes it all by the simple act of speaking it into being. God speaks and it happens. The second thing that I hear is creation is good. How many times in that passage did you hear the words, "And God saw that it was good"? I count 6 times. Now, this understanding that creation is good is in total opposition to what the nations around Israel believed. The nations around Israel, particularly the Babylonians, and remember this was developed in Babylon, they saw creation as something bad or less than perfect, something that happened. And if you read some of the Babylonian stories, and we will be in the next week or two, I will be bringing one or two of those around to contrast. You will see that they actually believed creation was not good. Creation was something that you somehow needed to break out of if you were going to find any meaning in the world whatsoever. You had to somehow transcend that. You had to somehow get out of that. But in the end, in many of the Babylonian stories, it was just a lost cause, because the Babylonian gods, and there were many gods that they believed in Babylon, would always push humanity down again whenever they tried to break out of the bad creation. But the biblical account says creation is good. And God says it is good. Third thing that I hear in this text is that creation has an order. Everything is in its place. The sun and the moon and the stars, the fish in the sea, the plants, the trees, the animals, and the humans. You might have noticed I stopped just before the point where God made humans, deliberately so, because that will be our theme for next week. But still, that idea that creation has an order is very obvious from what we see in that text. And a follow-on point from that, the order in creation makes life possible as we know it. To explain this, let's quickly just fly over those 6 days of creation. And I want to separate them in two groups of 3, day 1 to 3 and day 4 to 6. And then I want to point out something that really blew my mind when I first heard it. So let's quickly summarize. Day 1, God separates light and darkness. Day 2, God separates the water on the ground and the water in the sky, and lets trees and plants grow. In the understanding at that time, there was basically this sky in between the water. There was somehow a large dam of water somewhere up there. That was the understanding long before science explained how the atmosphere worked and so on. So let's not get too hung up about that it doesn't sound all that scientifically correct, because it was the best explanation that they had at that time. But the idea still of order. God separates the water up there with the water that's on the surface. And day 3, God separates the oceans and lakes from the dry land. So he separates that out. So those are the first 3 days. Light and darkness, separating water on the ground from water in the sky, and letting plants and trees grow. Sorry, that's an error. That should come under day 3, the letting the plants and trees grow. My mistake. So he separates the oceans and lakes from the dry land, and then on that very same day lets plants and trees grow. Okay, day 1 to 3. Day 4 to 6. Day 4, he creates the sun, moon, and stars, each in their place. Day 5, fish and water animals in the sea, and birds in the sky, again, each in their place. And then day 6, animals and humans to populate the land, each in their place. Now when we hear it like that, you probably can't quite grasp what I'm on about. So let me say it in a slightly different order. Let's see what day 1 and day 4 bring together. So day 1, separate light and darkness. And day 4, the sun, the moon, and the stars are each put in their place. Can you see how those two fit together? So he first creates the space where they are supposed to be, and then he fits them into that place. Day 2 separates the water on the ground and the water in the sky. Let's compare day 5 to that. He creates the fish and water animals for the sea, and he creates the birds of the sky. Day 2, he creates the environment where they can exist. Day 5, he populates that environment. Now day 3 and day 6, he separates the oceans and the lakes from the dry land, and then he makes animals and humans to populate the land, each in their place. Can you see the pattern there? It's not just bang and there it is. The idea that God creates a space where creation can thrive in, and then fills it with that creation. The poet goes to great lengths to show that God first made the environment that is needed to sustain things, and then placed the various things into that environment, one by one. But let me point out quickly that while this order is painted out in a lot of detail in a poetic way, it doesn't make all that much sense scientifically. And it doesn't have to. The truth is still there even if it doesn't make scientific, cold, hard sense. If we try to find cold, hard, factual truth in this poem, we will go home disappointed. Because let's think about it. How do you even have light and darkness on day 1 if the sun and the moon and so on are only created on day 4? Makes no sense. It doesn't have to make sense to still be truth. Has the poet never heard of the water cycle that every primary school child learns in about grade 4, I think it is? How that whole thing works with how the rain comes down and so on, that, or how the water gets up there in the top in the first place? Doesn't matter. Or how can the trees be pollinated and grow on day 3 if there are no bees or other insects or mice or birds to do that? Doesn't matter. The truth is still there. God created order. Let us not try to get a poem to be a science text. The truth of the poem of creation is not to be found in the cold, hard facts, but in the reality that is behind it, and the beautiful pictures that it paints. The poet uses a particular poetic method that we don't really know in Western poetry so much. I don't know, maybe this might be present in African poetry, but it definitely is in Hebrew, ancient Hebrew poetry, a thing called parallelism, where certain parallels are drawn out in the pictures. And that you can see from those comparisons that I drew from the different days, how that those parallels somehow then bring out the truth of it. There is order in creation, and that order sustains life as we know it. And the fifth and final point that I want to show today about this story of origin is this. Very important lesson. Don't get confused between the creation and the creator. And here the poet actually has some real fun. I already mentioned that the poems came into existence in Babylon during the exile. But of course, God, as the creator of the universe, was already understood in Israel long before that. That psalm that we prayed at the beginning of the service is much, much older. And already there, it's very clear that God is the creator of the universe. But suddenly, in the exile, the people of Israel were confronted with all sorts of other ideas. The Babylonians, as I already mentioned, had all sorts of gods. There were river gods, certain animals were gods, and of course the sun, the moon, and the stars were worshipped as gods. To this, the Hebrew poet had to give a clear answer. Come on, you Babylonians, get with the program. These things that you worship as gods are just part of the created order. The animals were made by God. The rivers were put in place by God. And these lights in the sky that you worship as gods too, those things, the true God just hangs into the sky like that, and like you would hang a lamp on your ceiling. Don't mix up the creation and the creator. So this is how far we go today in our exploration of the biblical story of origin. Next week, we look at perhaps the most fascinating, but at the same time the most glorious and the most tragic part of creation, humanity. And as you go into the week, may God open your eyes to the wonders of creation around you.